The sound of a family breaking does not always sound like a scream. Sometimes it sounds like a whisper. Sometimes it sounds like the delicate clink of silver against fine china. And sometimes, as I learned on the most painful night of my life, it sounds like absolute silence. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 65 years old, and for a long time I believed that love meant making yourself small so that others could have room to grow. I believed that a mother's duty was to remain invisible, to be the foundation that holds up the house but is never seen. But I was wrong. Silence is not a virtue when it costs you your dignity. Today I am going to tell you the story of how I lost my home, how I lost my son, and how, in the emptiness of having nothing left, I finally found myself. It all culminated on a snowy Sunday evening in November. My daughter-in-law Serena had decided to host a lavish dinner party for her family. This was happening in my house, the Victorian home with the wraparound porch, where my husband Arthur and I had raised our son Julian. The house where the floorboards creaked with the memories of 40 years of footsteps. Since Arthur passed away 5 years ago, I had continued to live there with Julian. When he married Serena 3 years ago, she moved in. I tried to be the accommodating matriarch. I tried to be modern and flexible. I swallowed my opinions like bitter pills and smiled until my jaw ached. That afternoon, Serena came into the kitchen. The air was thick with the scent of roasting rosemary and garlic. I was at the counter chopping vegetables for the side dish, trying to stay out of the way. Serena stood in the doorway wearing a dress the color of spilled wine. She looked beautiful and sharp. Everything about Serena was sharp. Her heels, her manicured nails, her tone of voice. "Eleanor," she said, and her voice had that deceptive sweetness that coats a pill of poison. "I need everything to be perfect tonight. My parents are flying in from New York. My brother is bringing his new fiancée. This dinner is about my family. I need you to understand that." I nodded because that is what I always did. I washed my hands and dried them on the faded floral apron that Arthur had given me for our 10th anniversary. I told her not to worry. I told her I would help with the serving, and then retreat to my room. I thought that was the compromise. I thought that was the deal we had struck in this Cold War. But at 7 o'clock, when the guests began to filter into the dining room, the atmosphere changed. I had spent the previous day polishing the mahogany table until it gleamed like a dark mirror. I had ironed the linen napkins. I had arranged the centerpieces of white lilies and holly. I peeked out from the hallway. The dining room was glowing with candlelight. Serena was laughing, holding a crystal wine glass, charming her parents. Julian was pouring drinks, looking tired but handsome. I took a deep breath, smoothed my gray hair, and walked into the room. I intended to say a brief hello and perhaps help bring out the soup tureen. But as I stepped into the light, the conversation stopped. Serena turned her head. Her smile didn't fade, but it froze. She walked over to me and placed a hand on my shoulder. It felt heavy. "Eleanor," she said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "I think there has been a misunderstanding. We don't have enough chairs at the main table." I looked at the table. It sat 10 people comfortably. There were 9 people in the room, including me. I counted the chairs. There were only 8. My chair, the chair at the foot of the table where I had sat for every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every birthday for 4 decades, was gone. Serena leaned in close and whispered, but the silence in the room was so profound that her whisper carried like a shout. "It would be better if you ate in the kitchen. You know how you get messy when you eat, and I want this dinner to be elegant. Go on now." I stood there frozen. The humiliation was a physical blow. It hit me in the chest and knocked the breath out of me. I looked at Serena's parents. They looked down at their plates, studying the pattern on the china. I looked at her brother. He swirled his wine, pretending not to notice. And then, I looked at Julian. My son. The boy I had nursed through fevers. The man I had comforted when his father died in his arms. He was standing by the sideboard. He looked at Serena, and then he looked at me. I waited for him to speak. I waited for him to say that this was ridiculous. I waited for him to bring a chair from the study. but Julian did nothing. He looked away. That was the moment the family broke. It wasn't the words Serena spoke. It was the silence Julian kept. I felt tears pricking my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I refused to give her that satisfaction. I gripped the fabric of my dress, turned around, and walked into the kitchen. As the door swung shut behind me, I heard the conversation start up again. I heard laughter. I heard the clinking of glasses. I sat on a wooden stool in the kitchen listening to the celebration of a family that had erased me. And as I sat there staring at the cold tiles, I realized that I couldn't do this anymore. I realized that my love for my son had become a cage. I realized that by staying, I was teaching him that it was acceptable to treat his mother like a servant. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand the history of that house. You need to understand what I was walking away from. I met Arthur when I was 22. He was a carpenter with rough hands and the gentlest eyes I had ever seen. We bought the house in Vermont when it was practically a ruin. It had broken windows and a leaking roof, but Arthur saw the potential. We spent the first 5 years of our marriage restoring it. We sanded every floorboard ourselves. We painted the walls. We planted the maple trees in the front yard that now towered over the roof. When Julian was born, the house came alive. I remember the smell of baby powder and warm milk. I remember Arthur building a tree house in the backyard. I remember the mornings when the smell of cinnamon rolls and brewing coffee would wake the boys up. That house was not just wood and brick. It was the physical manifestation of our love. It was a member of the family. The commonly is Maya. It was a member of the family. When Arthur died of a sudden heart attack while shoveling snow in the driveway, part of the house died with him. The silence was deafening. Julian was 28 then. He was an architect working in the city, but he came back home to help me. He was a good son. He was grieving too. We got through those first dark years together. We would sit on the porch in the evenings, wrapped in blankets, drinking tea and talking about Arthur. Then he met Serena. She was an interior designer. Sophisticated. Ambitious. She walked into our lives with the force of a hurricane. Julian was mesmerized. He had never met anyone like her. She was exciting. She had big plans. When he brought her home for the first time, she walked through the house, scanning the rooms not with warmth but with calculation. She pointed out the dated wallpaper. She mentioned that the kitchen layout was inefficient. She didn't ask about the photos on the mantelpiece. She didn't ask about the history. I tried to warn myself that I was just being protective. I told myself that she was just modern. When they got married, Julian asked if they could live with me for a while to save money for their own place. I agreed immediately. I wanted my son to be close. I wanted the house to be full of life again. But the erosion of my life began on day one. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, steady chipping away of my existence. First it was the furniture. Serena said that Arthur's favorite armchair, the worn leather one by the fireplace, was an eyesore. One day I came home from the grocery store, and it was gone. She had moved it to the garage and replaced it with a sleek, uncomfortable gray chair that looked like a piece of abstract art. Then it was the kitchen. She reorganized the cupboards. She threw away my spice jars, the ones with the handwritten labels, and replaced them with uniform glass containers. She complained about the smell of my cooking. She said my stews were too heavy, and the smell lingered in the curtains. She started ordering takeout or cooking complex minimalist meals that left us all hungry. Then it was the garden. My hydrangeas. The blue hydrangeas that Arthur and I had planted on our first anniversary. She had a landscaping crew dig them up because she wanted a zen garden with rocks and moss. She said flowers were messy. I watched my home disappear room by room. And with every change, I shrank a little more. I stopped playing my records in the living room because she complained about the noise. I stopped inviting my friend Martha over for tea because Serena made her feel unwelcome. I spent more and more time in my bedroom reading books and talking to Arthur's photo. Julian saw it happen. I know he did, but he was so desperate to please her. He was so afraid of her temper. Every time I tried to talk to him, he would sigh and say, "Mom, please don't make this difficult." She is just trying to make the house nice. You have to compromise. Compromise. That word became a weapon. But it wasn't a compromise. It was a surrender. And so we arrived at that night. The night of the dinner. Sitting in the kitchen listening to the party, I felt a clarity wash over me. It was cold and sharp like the winter air. I stood up. I didn't eat the food. I didn't wash the dishes that were piling up in the sink. Instead, I walked out of the kitchen and up the back stairs to my room. I pulled my old suitcase from the top of the closet. It was dusty. I hadn't used it since Arthur and I went to Cape Cod 10 years ago. I opened it on the bed and I started to pack. I didn't pack much. I packed my clothes. I packed the photo album of Arthur. I packed my jewelry box. And I packed the apron. The floral apron. It was stained and faded, but it was me. It was the symbol of the woman who had nurtured this family. I worked quietly. Downstairs, the party was winding down. I heard cars driving away. I heard the front door close. Then I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. Julian knocked on my door. I didn't answer. He opened the door and saw the open suitcase on the bed. He stopped. The color drained from his face. "What are you doing?" I folded a sweater and placed it in the bag. "I am leaving, Julian." He laughed nervously. A short disbelief sound. "What? Where are you going?" "Mom, stop it. You're overreacting. It was just one dinner." Serena was stressed. She didn't mean it. I turned to look at him. "My son. My beautiful, weak son." She meant every word, Julian. "And you let her. You stood there and you watched your wife banish your mother from her own table. You watched her treat me like a dog that needed to be put outside. And you said nothing." Julian flinched. "Mom, I didn't want to cause a scene. Her parents were there. I was going to talk to her later. There is always a reason to be silent, isn't there?" I zipped up the suitcase. "But I am done with silence. This house is no longer my home. It is a battlefield, and I am tired of fighting. I am tired of apologizing for existing. But where will you go? This is your house, Mom. The deed is in your name. You can't just leave." I picked up the suitcase. It was heavy, but I felt strangely light. "The house is just wood and stone, Julian. You and Serena have sucked the spirit out of it. You can have it. I don't want to live in a place where I am invisible." He tried to block the door. "Mom, please. Don't do this. We can fix this. I'll talk to her. I promise." I looked him in the eye. "You can't fix what is broken by begging. You have to fix yourself first. And you can't do that while I am here acting as your buffer. You need to be a husband, and you need to be a man. And you can't be either of those things while you are hiding behind me." I moved past him. He reached out to grab my arm, but then he let his hand drop. He knew. He knew I was right. I walked down the stairs. The house was quiet now. Serena was in the living room scrolling through her phone, probably looking at photos of the party. She looked up as I walked by with my suitcase. Her eyes widened. "Going on a trip, Eleanor?" she asked. There was a mockery in her voice. I stopped at the front door. I looked at the gray walls she had painted. I looked at the modern art she had hung. I looked at the Zen garden through the window. "Goodbye, Serena," I said. She didn't reply. She just smirked and went back to her phone. She thought I was bluffing. She thought I would be back in a day. She thought I had nowhere to go. I walked out into the cold November night. The wind was biting, but it felt clean. I got into my old sedan and I drove away. I didn't look back. I drove to Martha's house. Martha was my oldest friend. She lived in a small cottage on the other side of town. When she opened the door and saw me standing there with my suitcase and tears finally streaming down my face, she didn't ask a single question. She just pulled me inside and put the kettle on. I stayed with Martha for 2 weeks. I cried for the first 3 days. I mourned the loss of my life. I felt like a ghost. Who was Eleanor Vance if she wasn't a wife, a mother, or the keeper of the big Victorian house? I felt untethered, but Martha was wise. She told me that this was not an end but a beginning. She told me that I had spent 40 years taking care of everyone else, And now it was time to take care of Eleanor. I realized she was right. I couldn't wallow in self-pity. I had savings. Not a fortune, but enough. I started looking for a job. I hadn't worked in decades, not since before Julian was born, but I knew how to run a home. I knew how to cook. I knew how to organize. I found an advertisement in the local paper. A wealthy family, the Harrisons, were looking for a housekeeper and nanny for their 2 young children. They lived in a large estate on the outskirts of town. I went for the interview. Mrs. Harrison was a busy lawyer. She was kind but frantic. She looked at my resume, which was mostly blank, and then she looked at me. "Why do you want this job, Mrs. Vance? You are overqualified in life experience." I looked at her and spoke the truth. "Because I have a lot of love left to give. And I need a place where that love is valued." She hired me on the spot. Moving into the staff cottage on the Harrison estate was strange at first. It was small, just 2 rooms, but it was mine. I painted the walls a soft yellow. I put up my photos of Arthur. I bought a new armchair. A comfortable one with floral upholstery. My life took on a new rhythm. I woke up early. I helped get the children, Leo and Mia, ready for school. I cooked meals. I organized the house. But this time it was different. I was being paid. I was respected. Mrs. Harrison thanked me every evening. The children drew me pictures and hugged my legs when I came in the door. I started cooking again. Really cooking. I made my beef stew. I made the cinnamon rolls. The Harrison house began to smell like a home. One evening Mr. Harrison came into the kitchen. He was a quiet man, usually glued to his phone. He inhaled the scent of the pot roast I was making. "That smells like my grandmother's kitchen," he said. He smiled. A real, genuine smile. "Thank you, Eleanor." That night in my small cottage I took out my old floral apron. I touched the fabric. I realized that I wasn't just a servant. I was a creator of comfort. I was an architect of warmth. And for the first time in years, I felt proud. Meanwhile, Julian was calling me. At first, the calls were frantic. "Mom, where are you? Come home. Serena is furious, she says you made us look bad." I told him I was safe, but I refused to tell him where I was. I told him I needed space. Then the calls changed. "Mom, I can't find the insurance papers." "Mom, how do you work the washing machine?" "Mom, the house feels so cold." I listened. I gave him instructions. But I didn't offer to come over. Then the calls became sadder. Serena fired the cleaning lady again. She says nobody cleans it right. We are eating takeout every night. We are arguing a lot. She says I'm useless. I felt a pang of pain for my son. I wanted to rush to him. I wanted to fix it. But I remembered the lesson. I couldn't save him. He had to save himself. So I said, "I'm sorry to hear that, Julian. I hope you work it out." Winter turned to spring. The snow melted. The Harrison estate bloomed with tulips and daffodils. I was happy. I had made friends with the other staff. I had joined a book club in town. I was Eleanor Vance, the independent woman. I bought myself a new coat. I went to the cinema alone on Friday nights and enjoyed every minute of it. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, about 6 months after I had left, there was a knock on the door of my cottage. I opened it and saw Julian. He looked terrible. He had lost weight. His eyes were shadowed. He was wet from the rain. "How did you find me?" I asked. I asked Martha. I begged her. She finally told me. He stood there dripping on my welcome mat. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. He walked into my small yellow living room. He looked around. He saw the photos of his father. He smelled the fresh bread I had just baked. He saw the peace that permeated the room. "It's nice here," he said. His voice cracked. "It feels like you." I poured him a cup of tea. We sat in the floral armchairs. "I left her, Mom," he said. I put my teacup down. "When?" "Last night." He took a shaky breath. it has been a nightmare. Ever since you left, the buffer was gone. She turned all that criticism on me. Nothing I did was right. I didn't earn enough money. I wasn't ambitious enough. She hated the house. She wanted to sell it and buy a modern condo in the city. She said the house smelled like old people. He looked down at his hands. But the breaking point was yesterday. I came home early from work. She was on the phone with her mother. She didn't hear me come in. She was laughing, she said. I finally got the old hag out of the house, but now I'm stuck with her boring son. I'm just waiting until the market improves to sell this dump and take half the money. Then I'm filing for divorce. Julian looked up at me and there were tears in his eyes. She never loved me, Mom. She loved the security. She loved the house. She loved the control. I reached out and took his hand. Oh, Julian. I'm so sorry, he sobbed. I'm so sorry I let her treat you that way. I was so weak. I was so afraid of losing her that I lost you instead. And I lost myself. Can you ever forgive me? I squeezed his hand. A mother's forgiveness is not something you have to earn, Julian. It is always there. But you have to forgive yourself. He stayed for dinner. We ate stew and homemade bread. We talked for hours. For the first time in years, I saw my son. Not the anxious shadow he had become, but the man his father had raised. The divorce was messy. Serena fought for everything. She wanted the house. She wanted alimony. She wanted to destroy him. But Julian found his backbone. He hired a good lawyer. Since the house was in my name, she couldn't touch it. That was the one thing Arthur had insisted on before he died, keeping the deed in our names to protect the legacy. Serena was furious when she found out. She realized she had been playing a game she couldn't win. She left town a few months later. I heard through the grapevine that she moved to New York, looking for a wealthier husband. I didn't feel anger toward her anymore. I just felt pity. She was a woman who had a hole in her soul that no amount of fancy furniture or power could fill. She would never know the warmth of a real home, because she didn't know how to build one. Julian moved back into the big Victorian house. But he didn't ask me to come back to serve him. He asked me to come back as a partner. Mom, he said, I want to restore the house. I want to bring back the hydrangeas. I want to find Dad's old armchair. But I want you to live your life. You don't have to cook for me. You don't have to clean up after me. I want you to just be my mom. I decided to keep my job with the Harrisons for a while longer. I liked the independence. I liked having my own money. But I moved back into the big house. We spent that summer working in the garden. We replanted the blue hydrangeas. We painted over the gray walls with warm creams and soft greens. We brought the soul back into the building. One Sunday, a year after the terrible dinner, we hosted a barbecue. Martha came. The Harrisons came with the children. Neighbors we hadn't seen in years stopped by. The house was full of laughter and the smell of grilling meat and music. I stood on the porch watching the scene. Julian was manning the grill laughing with Mr. Harrison. Leo and Mia were running around the treehouse. Martha was drinking lemonade in the rocking chair. I looked down at myself. I was wearing a nice summer dress. I wasn't wearing an apron. I didn't need to hide behind it anymore. Julian looked up and saw me. He waved. He looked happy. He looked free. I realized then that the dinner that destroyed our family was actually the event that saved it. If Serena hadn't been so cruel, if she hadn't pushed me to the edge, I never would have left. I never would have found my own strength. Julian never would have seen the truth. We would have stayed trapped in that miserable cycle until the end of our days. Pain is a strange teacher. It burns the bridges that we are too afraid to cross ourselves. It forces us into the unknown. And sometimes, in that unknown, we find the parts of ourselves we thought were lost forever. I still live in the Victorian house, but it is different now. It is a shared space of respect. I still cook, but only when I want to. I still love my son, but I let him fight his own battles. And I keep the old floral apron hanging on a hook in the pantry. I don't wear it much anymore. But I keep it there as a reminder. A reminder that dignity is not given to you by others. It is something you carry inside you. It is a flame that can be dimmed but never extinguished. And no matter how many chairs they take away from the table, you can always build your own table. So to anyone listening who feels invisible in their own life, who feels that they are shrinking to fit into someone else's world, do not be afraid of the silence. Do not be afraid to walk out the door. Do not be afraid to shatter the plate, because sometimes everything has to break before it can be put back together the right way. That night, amidst the laughter on my porch, I raised my glass to the empty chair that wasn't there anymore. Not with bitterness, but with gratitude, because that missing chair forced me to stand up, and I have been standing tall ever since.